This is BBC World News America. Reporting from Washington, I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. President Trump says a deal's been done to end the US shutdown, reopening government for 3 weeks. But can he find agreement with the Democrats beyond then? A close ally of the president arrested in a pre-dawn raid. Roger Stone charged with 7 counts in the Russia probe. He says he's innocent.
I will plead not guilty to these charges. I will defeat them in court.
And he spent 544 days in an Iranian prison. We hear from journalist Jason Rezaian on his harrowing ordeal. Welcome to our viewers on public television in America and around the globe. After 35 days of a partial shutdown, President Trump's put forward a new deal to reopen the US government. But it's only for 3 weeks, and the proposal doesn't include funding for a wall on the southern border. The president threatened to declare a national emergency if the Democrats and him can't agree on border security. And if that wasn't enough drama, this morning a longtime ally of President Trump was arrested in a pre-dawn raid. Political strategist Roger Stone's been charged in connection with the investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election. He says he's innocent. And North America editor John Sopel reports on another eventful day in US politics.
Friday morning, and the extraordinary sight of the main domestic airport in New York at a virtual standstill. The government shutdown meaning there weren't enough air traffic controllers to keep planes flying safely. Day 35 of the longest shutdown in history, and 800,000 workers were missing another payday. But today, however he sought to portray it otherwise, the president caved.
I am very proud to announce today that we have reached a deal to end the shutdown and reopen the federal government.
The shutdown was triggered when the president said unless there was $5 billion for his border wall, he'd keep the government closed indefinitely. Then he said he wanted a down payment. But now the federal government will reopen without a cent having been pledged.
And there's fresh fruit, hot coffee.
As millions were affected and food lines grew, so the pressure piled up on the president. Polls showed that he was overwhelmingly being blamed for the shutdown.
Disagreement in policy should never be a reason to shut down government, really shouldn't, especially, again, for a period of time that has an impact on the paychecks. I'm sad it has taken this long. I'm glad that we've come to a conclusion today as to how we go forward.
This has been a rough few days for the president. He got himself into an arm wrestle with the Speaker of the House, 78-year-old Nancy Pelosi, and lost. His demands for border wall funding haven't been met. And this morning, one of his longtime associates and close confidants was arrested as part of the Mueller investigation. Roger Stone, provocateur, flamboyant, lifelong Republican operative, specialist in dirty tricks, and one-time aide to Richard Nixon. And as of 4 o'clock this morning, when the FBI moved in mob-handed, the latest person to be arrested in the Mueller investigation into collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. After Stone's court appearance, he emerged the very picture of defiance, almost emulating Richard Nixon.
I will plead not guilty to these charges. I will defeat them in court. I believe this is a politically motivated investigation. I am troubled by the political motivations of the prosecutors.
His indictment containing details of texts he'd sent that read as though they were taken from The Godfather or The Sopranos. To one he writes, "You are a rat, a stoolie, you backstab your friends. I am so ready, let's get it on, prepare to die," expletive. The indictment alleges that Stone was the key conduit between Russia, Julian Assange's WikiLeaks, and the release of thousands of stolen emails from the Democratic National Committee, deeply damaging to Hillary Clinton. Today the White House was saying, so what?
This has nothing to do with the president, has nothing to do with the White House.
But though the president protests that the Mueller investigation is a hoax and a witch hunt, more and more key figures have been snared over their contacts with Russia and the lies they told to cover their tracks. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Well, we'll hear more about Roger Stone's arrest in just a minute. But first, let's get the latest about the temporary end to the government shutdown. I spoke a short while ago with our political analyst, Ron Christie. So, Ron, 35 days. What do you think changed the game?
I think really two game changers here, Rajini. Good evening to you. Number one was the President's Secretary of Commerce, a billionaire, making a flip comment about people who are out of work. They can borrow money. They can find other ways to survive. I think came across as being very insensitive. And number two, we saw 6 Republican senators join with the Democrats last night in an attempt to reopen the government. So I think the president felt the pressure was coming on him. These senators were from some very key re-electoral states, and he decided for now he was going to find an impasse, a solution with the Democrats to give himself more wiggle room.
You say for now because this solution is only a 3-week one, so we could be back in the same situation mid-February.
Correct. Although I don't think the president, having gone through 35 days of having the government shut down, I don't think he wants to deal with that again. But I do believe an opportunity exists that the president, if he doesn't get his wall money, what he really insisted upon for the last month or so, he might declare a national emergency on the southern border with Mexico and then have the United States Army begin constructing his wall. So no more government shutdowns, I believe, in the short term, but in the longer term, the president might get his wall through a very politically unpopular move.
And yet the Democrats still say they don't want to fund a border wall.
They do, and we've seen that Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, the minority leader and the Speaker of the House, got what they wanted. What did they want? No money for the wall. The Democrats stood firm. They stood united, and they come out of this looking like they moved the president to their will. So they don't really have any incentive to give the president any money for his wall because he's shown that he was willing to back down.
The president likes to see himself as someone who can do a deal. So what can we expect to see in the next few weeks?
I believe the vice president, the president, and the congressional leadership are going to be working very closely, looking at homeland security issues. I believe the Democrats will get some of what they want, which, of course, is electronic surveillance and other mechanisms to provide safety and security at the border. But ultimately, Rajini, it's going to be the question of, does the president get a physical barrier through the United States Congress? And at this juncture, I do not believe the Democrats are going to give him any additional funding for him to do so. So look for unilateral action by the president, I believe, on February 15th or shortly thereafter.
And yet, when the president spoke today about the wall, his language seemed to soften somewhat, saying it won't necessarily be a concrete wall, it won't be a medieval wall. So do you think the definition of what that wall is slowly changing?
Yeah, I think the term wall seems to be an evolution in process. First, it was going to be a concrete wall. Then it was going to be a barrier. Then it was going to be something we could see through. So at this juncture, as long as there is a physical structure that looks like what we would normally call a wall, I think he would declare victory. I just don't believe the Democrats have the political incentive or the pressure at this juncture to give the president what he wants.
And just very briefly, Ron, who do you think has come out of this better, the Democrats or the president?
Sadly, as a Republican, I believe the Democrats have, but ultimately I think who's come out the best of this? The 800,000 furloughed employees who now get paid and now go back to work. I think those are the true winners here.
Ron Christie, it's always a pleasure to speak to you.
Good to see you.
Now back to today's indictment of close Trump ally Roger Stone. To help explain it all, I was joined earlier by Joseph Moreno, former federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice. Now, we saw earlier a very defiant Roger Stone still defending President Trump. How significant are these arrests today? Or is this arrest?
So, despite the White House and Roger Stone himself and his defense team putting a brave face on this, this is significant, right? Because we have watched for nearly 2 years as the special counsel's investigation has made move after move after move. But Roger Stone has remained relatively untouched until today. And we've always wondered, he seemed to occupy a very critical position because he seemed like he would be the individual who would know if there was a connection between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks, which of course was the organization that released Hillary Clinton's emails. So after many, many months of quiet, now we know, and despite the fact that it's been long awaited, it was still dramatic with this very pre-dawn raid on Roger Stone's Florida home, and seeing him in court a bit disheveled but still defiant, we now know sort of the ramifications of what he's done.
You've got the paper there, the indictment, 26 pages, I think. What were the most striking things that you pulled out of that?
Well, You could have charged a case against Roger Stone in a lot fewer pages than this, if this were simply a case of a dirty political trickster who then lied about it to Congress. Beyond that, there's a lot of additional facts in here that were not necessary to just bring this case against Roger Stone. And most significantly, what jumped out at me was the fact that it lays out in detail numerous communications and coordinations between Mr. Stone and the Trump campaign. It looked like it wasn't just one, it wasn't just two, there were multiples in terms of understanding what WikiLeaks had, trying to figure out selectively what kinds of emails they may have collected, understanding when they may be released for best strategic value to the campaign. So it now answers the question, was there some sort of coordination at least between the campaign and WikiLeaks? Now the answer seems to be yes. And in addition, Roger Stone was not just acting as a lone agent here. It shows that he was coordinating with the campaign and benefiting them.
How much of a concern should this be to President Trump?
Well, again, Sarah Sanders put on a very brave face, saying that this document in all pages never mentions President Trump or the White House. Literally, that's true, right? President Trump is not named in here, nor is the White House. But the fact is that it connects the Trump campaign quite significantly to Roger Stone. And it mentions senior members of the Trump campaign. Well, guess what? The Trump campaign was not that large of an organization. So when you think about who the senior directors of the Trump campaign were, that narrows it down to a few individuals that are in the close orbit of the president.
And just briefly, what does this reveal about where you think the Mueller investigation is going?
Well, there's two possibilities, right? One possibility is that it is a narrow indictment and that it starts and ends with Roger Stone, right? He was a trickster, he negotiated and facilitated the release of these stolen emails, and then he lied about it, and now he's facing the consequences. I don't think it ends there, though, because there are so many more facts in here that were not necessary to bring this case against Roger Stone. I believe it's laying the foundation for further steps to come. I think it will be fleshing out who were those individuals at the Trump campaign, what was the extent of the coordination, and who knew about it. And these are basic answers that the Mueller probe has been after since the beginning, and the American people, frankly, have been waiting patiently to find out.
Joseph Moreno, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Regina. Good to be here.
Let's take a look at some of the day's other news. The leader of Sudan's largest opposition parties joined the calls for President Omar al-Bashir to step down as protests against the government roll into a sixth week. Hundreds of protesters took to the streets following Sadiq al-Mahdi's address. Police fired tear gas to try to disperse them. Activists say as many as 50 people have been killed since the unrest began. Emergency services in Brazil say 200 people are missing after a dam collapsed. It's been reported that several people were killed when a torrent of mud and sludge hit the village of Brumadinho. President Jair Bolsonaro has already announced he'll visit the affected region on Saturday. You're watching BBC World News America. Still to come on tonight's programme. Uncovering centuries of history in London. What archaeologists are digging up in the largest excavation ever seen in the UK. Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro says he will send his foreign minister to the UN on Saturday to attend a Security Council meeting on the country's growing political crisis. The US will urge members to recognise Venezuela's opposition leader, Juan Guaido, as the interim president. Meanwhile, as the political struggle deepens, the people of Venezuela are fleeing a country plagued with hyperinflation and food shortages. Here's Alim Muqbal.
Crisis in Venezuela is nothing new. But there's no question it's escalated dramatically and potentially dangerously in recent days. It's driving people across this border into Colombia in large numbers. Jeffrey just fled Caracas with almost nothing and is trying to help sell goods in the market to make enough to survive. This has never happened before in Venezuela, he says. The president's bringing down the country. Things have never been so bad. Well, everybody here, the police, aid agencies and local people are all telling us there's been a massive surge in people coming across the border, fleeing from Venezuela into Colombia. Here, it's those with immigration papers, but the numbers suggest that many more are crossing illegally at other parts of the border. So anxious are they about the situation back home. Many of them have poured into this shelter close by, offering free food. Now, with an opposition figure having declared himself as the country's leader, there are fears about how the president, Nicolas Maduro, will react. Mari Carmen hopes Maduro will fall so she can return home, but doesn't believe it'll happen. She also says she doesn't trust America's motives.
For a while now, people have been saying the American president has been helping to create this crisis so he could intervene. In the end, we just don't know the truth of the situation. We just know that we're hungry and fearful.
Refugee families here feel they're just caught in a big political game over which they have no control.
In 2014, the Washington Post's Tehran bureau chief was arrested in Iran on charges of spying for the US. Jason Rezaian was held in prison for 544 days, including some time spent in solitary confinement. He was released in a prisoner swap between the two countries. Now he's suing the Iranian government for his time in captivity. He's also out with a new memoir, Prisoner, which looks back at his time being held hostage. Earlier, Jason Rezaian joined me in the studio. Let's start with the circumstances surrounding your arrest that day in July 2014.
So I was going about my life in Iran, working as a journalist, covering everything that one does in a country, including the nuclear negotiations between Iran and world powers. And my wife and I were on the verge of coming back here to the United States for a little R&R to recharge before what was to be a very long slog of working this particular story. And very suddenly, we were apprehended in our home as we were getting ready to leave our apartment to go to a party and taken off to Evin prison, the most notorious prison in that part of the world, and one that has often been the long-term home of political prisoners, foreign nationals, and journalists like myself.
You write in very vivid detail about how you were held in solitary confinement. Just explain to our viewers what it was like.
Well, you know, the first 7 weeks that I was in prison, I was in solitary. And I hope that that's not something that anybody ever has to experience. And what I tried to do in the book was give readers a glimpse of what a day-to-day experience of being in solitary is like. It's designed to really disassociate you from reality, to make you go insane, and it works. The cell that I was in was about 1.5 meters by 2.5 meters wide. It was lit 24 hours a day, and my only access to anything outside of the cell were my interrogation sessions. So this was the ping pong of my life for seven weeks of going to interrogations where I was accused of very absurd and ridiculous charges. And then back to solitary to contemplate what was next, and it was it's horrifying. I mean, it's not something that anybody should have to endure.
Let's talk about some of those absurd and ridiculous charges. Sure. They include your interrogators going through some of your websites and some of the things that you've done, and also a story about avocados.
I didn't realize people would find this so interesting, but I did at the time. On the first night, I was told that a Kickstarter project on the well-known crowdfunding website that I had tried to implement in 2010 and failed to achieve the funding for, an avocado farm that I thought we could bring to Iran, became the core charge against me. That this was somehow code word for a secret project that I had, along with the CIA and the American government, to topple the Iranian regime. Obviously, that didn't hold a lot of water, and that's part of why I'm talking about it now, because oftentimes when we hear about dual nationals or foreign nationals being held in Iranian prison, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, the Iranian Brit who's being held right now, is being held on very similar types of charges. And you know, while the charges themselves are very serious, the circumstances behind the charges are farcical, and they should be considered as such.
You talk about Miss Radcliffe or Mrs. Radcliffe. How do you think the US government handled your release? And then we'll come on to how we think other governments should handle it.
Well, look, you know, I was just talking to a colleague of mine who is the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, Joel Simon, who's written a book about hostage release and ransom and the ways that different governments deal with these situations. Iran makes it complicated because it's a state that is doing these hostage takings, but wrapping them in a judicial proceeding. So it's a judicial hostage taking is what we'd like to call it. And I think that the U.S. government, because it was dealing with Iran in these negotiations, had an opportunity to work to bring me home. And my family and my employer at the Washington Post did not have their hands tied in the same way that a private citizen would if their relative or loved one was taken by a terrorist organization or pirates. And every country, whether it's the UK, the United States, Canada, other Western European countries, Australia and Japan, who are usually the likely targets of these hostage takings, has a different policy of what they're willing to do. Some have a very stark no concessions policy, and others say, you know, we'll pay for the release of hostages. I don't think that there's one right answer, but I do think that as free societies and democracies, the value of our citizens' lives and freedom is one of the most important values that we have, that we share as free societies. And I think everything that should be done to free people who are held hostages is the imperative of these governments.
Just very briefly, a lot's changed now since you were held captive.
Yep.
US-Iran relations are very different. How do you see them now?
Well, I think that they're in a worse state than they've been at any point in a very long time. You know, you can agree or disagree with the engagement with Iran or the policy of the Trump administration versus the Obama administration. What I don't like is that I think that a lot was learned in the process of those nuclear negotiations by the Americans who were dealing with Iranian counterparts for the first time in 35 years. And the knowledge that was gained in that process is not being taken advantage of right now.
Jason Rezaian, this is your book, Prisoner. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Now to London, where the largest archaeological excavation in the UK is underway to make way for a new high-speed rail line. But during the digging, a grave of one of Britain's greatest maritime explorers was found. His final resting place had long been forgotten, as David Sillito reports.
Back in the 1780s, London was running out of space. It had nowhere for the dead, and so it created new cemeteries. One of them is here, next to Euston Station. And now, more than 200 years later, that land is needed for another purpose. The dead are going to have to find a new final resting place. And this is the reason why. This is where London's high-speed railway station is about to be built. And so, a small army of archaeologists have arrived to move thousands of bodies.
So, how many people are we talking about who are buried here?
So the records for the entire area suggest around 60,000 people were interred in the cemetery.
Of course, some have over the years already been removed, but there's still a huge number of people buried here.
We are looking at probably dealing with around 40,000 individuals. That's still one of the largest post-medieval burial excavations ever to take place.
You're excavating 40,000 plots?
Yes.
And this huge tented site is only the beginning.
And where I'm standing here at the moment is going to be one of the platforms, and it's going to run 500 metres along there. And that's what gets you about this site. It is the sheer size of it, 11,000 square metres.
But what will happen to all the bodies? Matthew Flinders, the first man to sail around Australia, is buried here. So too is Bill Richmond, one of Britain's most celebrated boxers.
Initially they will be taken for archaeological analysis, so laboratories. They'll be stored in a morgue, and again that's with the agreement of the church.
And then after that, everyone will be reburied in consecrated ground. And this is just the beginning. This is a location near Stoke Mandeville, the site of a lost church. Iron Age, Roman and Saxon sites crisscross the whole route.
Overall on the whole line, during the peak, we're going to have over 1,000 archaeologists excavating over 60 sites.
That sounds pretty big in archaeology terms.
It's the biggest archaeological investigation ever undertaken in the UK and probably Europe.
In this part of London, any development is always going to be building on history, but this one has rather more ghosts than normal. David Sillito, BBC News.
Well, that's it for today's show and for my time here on BBC World News America. You can keep in touch with me on Twitter. I'm at BBC Rajini V. You can check us out on our website as well. Thanks for watching BBC World News America. Have a wonderful weekend.